Hi everyone, thanks for joining me. Just another update on the Scammell and a few things to chat about. Here's how the engine looks now. We've got the fan on and the fan belt and one or two other things looking really good. But what I wanted to chat about was the radiator that you fit to the front of this and how I think I'm going to deal with that. So here's the radiator all made up. One or two issues with that, but nothing really that you guys won't be able to sort out. The worst part was this this like plate here. I fitted this after the sides, top, bottom, and inside were all put together. So that's 5 parts. When I went to fit this, it wouldn't fit within the recess. So what I had to do was sand off some of the top, in fact quite a bit. Now, I was wondering whether I should have fitted this prior to doing other parts. So for instance, perhaps doing the bottom and the top and the middle, fitting this back plate and then adding the sides. I don't know. But as I say, I sanded some off the top because I didn't want to damage this notch here. And the other thing I did was I cleaned out the step inside this top part and the step inside the bottom part, and made sure that they were thoroughly clean so that it would fit in. And once I got it close enough that it looked like it was going to fit, once I put the glue in, that acted like a lubricant and that fitted on there. So that was one challenge. But I want to show you how I think I'm going to deal with fitting the radiator to the actual engine. Focus, damn you, focus. Right, so this is the instructions, and as you can see, this back plate fits on there, and then the radiator, it fits with this small part coming off the engine, and that fits in that slot there. And then I think if we look at the other side, there's another small part that fits in the bottom. So we've got this small part here which fits there, and then this end fits in the radiator there. Now as you can see, that is a very thin part, and the part on the top is very thin as well. What I plan to do, and I've looked ahead in the instructions, is that the radiator sits on the chassis of the cab, and so I intend to fit the radiator once that I can get to that stage, rather than fitting it to these two small parts and have it keep breaking off. The next issue is to do with the steering rack. So this steering rack, I think that's what it's called, fitting these parts isn't a problem. Yeah, this rod will fit through that slot, and you can push it through to this slot and out the other side, so you haven't got to worry about fitting it before you put this together. This tube, or whatever it is, bracing bit or whatever, fits inside. You can see the arrows telling you to fit it in there and in there. But what was a real headache was fitting the spring. There's nothing that tells you where to fit the spring to this. Now I'm not, as I keep mentioning, and I will keep mentioning it, I'm not a car modeler or anything like that. I don't know anything about cars or lorries. And I thought this piece butted up to this piece, and I was scratching my head for ages because it just didn't seem to sit right. What I did was I looked at the next picture. So on this picture, this part has been flipped over, so now the tube that I mentioned, rather than it being underneath, it's on top. And from this picture you can see that the spring hangs below the steering mechanism. So I thought, well, okay, so if that's below it, then it can't be butting up to it. and I worked it out how it should fit. So here's the part as we just saw in the picture, and this is actually only this isn't glued in actually. If I pull it apart without breaking it, so I'll take this rod out for the moment, it's going to fall out anyway. So that's your one part, yeah, and then you see these squares here, well they fit in to the squares on here. So what you do is you just put that in there, and then hopefully not breaking anything, put that in there. Job's a good one. And now I've shown you that, I'll glue it. So that was the next problem that I came over, and there are no arrows on that directions to tell you to do that or where it sits. So I'm quite pleased I've worked that one out. So progress is being made. I've actually started doing the chassis, which is, I'll just show you that stage there, and then I can think about putting that steering arm or whatever, steering rack on the chassis itself. I've fitted this small part down here, and then hopefully the two parts, because this is you're not supposed to glue this here and here, you're just supposed to pop it in. I'm hoping that that will just pop in and everything will be good. So that's that phase out the way. So moving on to the next phase. Basically I've got to put the chassis together, and I did that and there weren't any issues, so that was pretty good. I say there weren't any issues. There wasn't until I came to fit the steering rack. If we just move over to this next picture. So we got all the parts fitted from the previous picture. All we got to do now is fit the steering rack in there without gluing it, and then we fit it down to this point here without gluing it, and we put this plate on the opposite side so it locks this pivot point in position, yeah, and it shows you a small diagram of how to do that. Right, I had a problem. In fact, I had two problems. One of them was of my own making, the other one I'm not so certain about. When you put this plate on here to pinch this pivot point in position, this piece under here seems to be too wide. What happened was this part was bending out, so it wasn't sitting properly. What I had to do was I put some evergreen plastic, thin plastic in there first, then I put this plate on top. Now the reason I found this out, what I'd done is I'd fitted this part and I thought that this would just click in, but what had happened was it bent it, so I had to and soften this with glue, get a knife underneath to try and get it back off the plastic part, and then I put this small piece of evergreen on there. So I'll try and get the actual build for you, and we can have a look at it together. So here's the part in question. You'll notice that the hole's no longer all the way through. I can just get a drill bit and drill that through, not a problem. If I turn it slightly, I noticed earlier in the video that it was going out of focus. You can see there's a thin strip of plastic there, so that's a spacer that I've provided to fit this part onto, which meant that the spring where it pivots on that point would fit in there nicely. So I don't think that was my fault. I think the part is a bit wider than they allow. This next part was my fault. It was this piece here. So if you remember on that, we'd got to fit in the rear of the steering rack, and there was like a pivot point that fitted into a hole. Well, when I fitted this bar, which this is attached to, I didn't have this plate at 90 degrees to the bar. sorry, 90 degrees to the chassis, and so this kept popping out. It wasn't holding it. What I did there was got some more evergreen, drilled a hole in it, glued that to the plate, and then this would pop in and sit in the hole that I provided in the evergreen. So that was definitely my fault. I should have had it at a better angle. The next problem I had, we're going back to the steering rack. You see this part here? That's where I believe the road wheel will fit on for the front of the vehicle, yeah. And it's now, I thought this symbol meant don't glue this part into this. You want it to pivot on those points. So I didn't glue it. I put it in there. Everything was fine. Actually, I was quite lucky. When I glued this part together, all I did was I glued from there along there. So when I fitted the part together, these two parts were still they weren't glued. So when I wanted to fit this in, I could just separate these ends and it would pop in, and then I glued that part, and I made sure that I didn't glue the disc here. What I then did, when this was all set up, I glued where it says here to this rod, yeah, and I think that was a mistake, because once I've glued that to that rod, this point won't pivot on the rod. So even though you're turning on this point here, this pivot point here, you can't, it will give slightly, but that is a fixed point now, and so it won't move backwards and forwards. What I should have done was not glue that to that point. Now there is a very small pin moulded onto this piece, and there's a very small hole moulded onto this piece. If you're doing this kit, just try and see if that hole is sufficient and that pin is sufficient for that not to be glued, and it will work backwards and forwards. I can try and rectify it. I can try and run some Tamiya extra thin to see if I can separate the parts. The only issue is there may be residue plastic on either of the parts, and therefore it won't sit properly within the parts, and therefore it won't work anyway. So again, I think the instructions are a bit ambiguous there. I think what they should have done was perhaps not had an indicator no glue there and a no glue there, but I could just be making excuses for myself. Moving on to construction 3, no problems at all. No problems at all. It was straightforward, gluing stuff together. And that goes for this next part as well. Again, just gluing parts together, fitted really well. Stage 4. No problems with this until it comes to fit this part here onto there. There's no locating pins, so what you've got is a flush back and a flush front, and what you got to try and do is work out how to get that hole to be in the right spot to fit in that hole, yeah. So if I get the part, if I can find it, so here's the part, and you want that hole to go all the way through into this. I think this is a small engine, so I think it's going into the engine block, but you got to be careful, because this pin that goes in is supposed to be able to rotate it. You're not supposed to glue it. So initially I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll glue this part to that part, which I did do, and then I'll put this pin in through those two parts, and I've already done these two parts, and so the pin will help to locate that hole. But my concern was that if any glue was within these between this part and the block, then it might glue this section, this pin, into there, and then it won't rotate. So a very simple solution to this one, thankfully. The cocktail stick is about the right diameter of that hole. So what I did was, obviously not with this one, I chopped the end off, so I just got like a flush end. I put that in the part and then got some glue, glued, sorry I keep moving out of shot, glued between these two parts, fitted the part, and then when I felt it was sufficiently stuck, I just pulled the cocktail stick out. Now obviously with the cocktail stick being wooden, it can't melt to the plastic, unlike the actual kit part. It'll absorb some of the glue, so it may kind of glue to the part, but it won't be as strong as some other. It won't be as strong as if plastic was gluing to plastic, and that meant that I was able to get this in the right position, this plate here, and get it straight as well, as you can see, because there was no locating bits for that. So the rest of the build for this small engine went fine, no issues at all. I'm just starting to do step 5, which, as you can see, is the pulleys for the cable. The only thing to be careful of here, because I nearly had an accident with this, you see this part D6, it's there's a very thin section of plastic between this roller and this roller, and there's a notch in it as well. If you look at here, you can see that the bottom of this part fits into the notch between these two rollers. I nearly broke that third roller off because of this very thin section of plastic here. So that's all you got to be careful of there. So I'm on step 5. I've calculated that 81 parts have gone into this build so far, and that's been the engine, the front spring, and the steering rack, and this small engine for the, I think it's going to be for the pulleys, for the wire to pull vehicles on and off. Pull vehicles onto the trailer. Right, I think that'll do for this update number 2. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope all your builds are going well, and I'll catch up with you soon.